The morning my husband told me I looked ridiculous standing in that courtroom, I was wearing the only blazer I owned. It was navy blue, slightly too big in the shoulders, bought 3 years earlier for a job interview I never ended up needing because he had insisted I quit. I had pressed it the night before in his kitchen, alone, while he was upstairs laughing at something on his phone. I remember thinking, if I iron it slowly enough, maybe it won't look secondhand. Maybe no one will know. They knew. His attorney was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my car. Custom. Gray with a faint pinstripe. Cufflinks. He set his leather portfolio on the plaintiff's table like he was placing a chess piece, deliberate and unbothered. And when he glanced at me standing at the opposite table with my manila folders held together by 2 rubber bands, he smiled. Not at me. Sort of past me. The way you smile at something that doesn't require your full attention. My husband. I'll call him my husband because that's what he still legally was that morning. Sat beside that attorney and didn't look at me at all. He was talking quietly to the woman next to him. She had her hand on his forearm. I had seen that hand before in photos I wasn't supposed to find, on a phone I wasn't supposed to unlock. She was wearing a silk blouse the color of champagne, and her nails were done and she smelled like something expensive. I know because she walked past me to take her seat in the gallery, and the scent hit me like a small, precise cruelty. I stood at my table. I straightened my folders. I told myself to breathe. I need to back up. My name is Iris. I am 31 years old. I was a junior accountant at a mid-sized logistics firm when I met my husband, whose name I will call Grant, because that is not his name, but it is close enough to how he carried himself. Like something had been granted to him at birth, and he'd spent every year since confirming that. We met at a fundraiser for a children's hospital, which I only attended because my coworker had an extra ticket and nobody else wanted to go on a Thursday night. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming when they practiced it long enough that it no longer looks like practiced. He found me by the drinks table. He said something that made me laugh. He asked for my number before I finished my glass. We dated for 14 months. We got engaged. We married in a small ceremony in Vermont, which was beautiful. And I will let myself keep that. Some things you don't have to give back. For the first 2 years, everything felt like building something. We bought a house. Well, we used his family money for the down payment, which I told myself was just a head start, not a foundation that only he could touch. I kept working for a while, but he worked long hours and traveled often for his consulting firm, and it seemed to make more sense for me to be available when he was home, to build a life around his schedule, to be the person who made sure the house ran so that he didn't have to think about it. He said he needed that from me. He said it like it was a gift I was giving him. I left my job 18 months into our marriage. That is the part I go back to the most. Not because I blame myself. I have spent too many sessions with my therapist learning not to do that, but because I want to understand the mechanics of it. How a person becomes dependent so slowly that they don't feel themselves becoming dependent. How reasonable each individual step sounds, and how far from your starting point you end up. By year 4, I had no income, no professional references that were current, a gap on my resume I didn't know how to explain, and a joint bank account that was, technically, accessible to me, except that he reviewed every transaction and had a way of asking about things I spent money on that made me feel like I was being audited in my own home. The house was in his name. The car I drove was in his name. Even the health insurance was through his employer. I thought about leaving, sometimes, in the abstract. And then I would think about leaving and imagine having nothing, nowhere to go, no income, no recent work history. And I would tell myself it wasn't that bad, it was just how things were. Plenty of marriages look like this. I was being dramatic. I found out about the other woman on a Tuesday in March, which is an ordinary day for something that ends your life as you know it. I didn't confront him right away. That matters. I want you to understand that I did not scream or throw anything or demand answers while I was still shaking. I went for a drive, in his car technically, and I sat in a parking lot for 2 hours, and I thought very carefully about what I knew, what I didn't know, and what I needed to find out before I said a single word. I had spent years doing our household accounting, tracking expenses, organizing receipts, reconciling statements every month because he preferred it that way, and because I was good at it, and because it gave me something to do that felt like contributing. It meant I knew the accounts. I knew the inflows and the outflows. I knew which statements were missing from the folder he kept in his desk, and I knew what categories he had been listing them under. What I had suspected for months, and quietly confirmed over the following 6 weeks, was that my husband's consulting firm was not purely a consulting firm. He had a second set of clients. I don't mean affair clients, though yes, that too. I mean financial clients. Clients whose transactions moved through accounts that weren't registered anywhere I could find, that were structured in a way that I, a former accountant, recognized immediately as designed to obscure origin. Shell structures. Invoices for services that didn't match any engagement letter. Payments received from LLCs whose registered agents were addresses in states where neither he nor any person I could identify had any connection. I am not a forensic accountant. I want to be clear about that. I am a woman who once got a B+ in auditing and spent 4 years living inside her husband's financial life because there was nothing else to occupy her mind. I printed everything I could access. I organized it the way I would have organized a client file. I put it in a binder. And then I called my sister. My sister is named Alice, and she is 3 years older than me, and she is the person who picked up every phone call during those 6 weeks when I was quietly unraveling while pretending to be fine. She is also an attorney. Not a family law attorney, she handles commercial litigation. But she knows people, and the first person she had me call was not a divorce lawyer. It was a contact at the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI. I know how that sounds. I know. But I had a binder, and the contact was a former colleague of hers, and the meeting was, officially, just a conversation. I went in with my binder and my laptop and my flash drive with copied files, and I sat across from 2 agents in a nondescript office, and I walked them through everything I had found, the same way I would have walked through a variance report methodically, with documentation, without editorializing. They asked me to come back. I came back 4 times. During all of this, I was still living in the house. I was still cooking dinner. I was still ironing his shirts. I was still being the person he had built into the walls of his life so thoroughly that he couldn't imagine I had any interior of my own. He served me with divorce papers 9 weeks after I had first spoken to the FBI. I don't know if he suspected anything. I think he just thought the timing was right, that he had found a better option and was ready to move on. That I had no resources and no leverage and would take whatever settlement his attorney drafted, because what choice did I have? The papers cited irreconcilable differences. He told me, the morning he handed them to me at the kitchen table, handed them to me, like we were signing for a package, that I should find a legal aid clinic because I wasn't going to be able to afford anything else. He said it without cruelty, which was somehow worse than cruelty. He said it the way you tell someone to take an umbrella. Informational. Already on to the next thing. I told him I would look into it. I did not look into it. What I did was file the response myself, using forms I had studied for 3 weeks, and list myself as a pro se litigant. His attorney filed a motion almost immediately claiming I was unqualified to represent myself and requesting the court dismiss my response. The motion was denied. You cannot be denied the right to represent yourself in an American court. That is settled law. His attorney knew that. He filed it anyway, I think, because he wanted me to feel the weight of opposition before we even began. He wanted me rattled. I was not rattled. I was terrified, which is not the same thing. The morning of the hearing, I arrived 45 minutes early. I sat in my car, in the parking lot, and I ate half a granola bar, and I read through my folders one more time, even though I had read through them so many times the paper had gone soft at the edges. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Beige walls, fluorescent light, the particular silence of a place where bad news gets delivered regularly and everyone has agreed to be professional about it. I set up my folders in a row. I had color-coded tabs. I had a legal pad with my points listed in order of what I intended to address first. When Grant walked in with his attorney, he looked at my table once, and then he leaned over and said something quiet to the attorney, and they both smiled. The woman from the gallery, she had come. She had actually come. settled into a seat in the front row like she was at a theater. The judge entered. We rose. He sat. His name was the Honorable Judge Callahan, and he had the bearing of a man who had heard every version of every story and retained the capacity to be interested anyway, which is either a professional skill or a kind of grace, and I was grateful for it. Grant's attorney went first. He was smooth. He laid out an argument for asset division that was so favorable to my husband it was almost elegant in its audacity. The house, the investment accounts, the vehicles, a settlement structured as a lump sum that sounded large until you considered I would need to support myself indefinitely on it, with no current income and a 6-year resume gap. Then it was my turn. I stood up. I heard someone in the gallery make a small sound. Not loud, just enough. I knew what it meant. I smoothed the front of my blazer, the navy one, the slightly too big one, and I picked up my first folder. Your Honor, I said, I'd like to begin by addressing the asset claims being made by the petitioner, because I believe there is significant relevant context that the court has not yet been presented with. Grant's attorney was already shaking his head slightly, the way attorneys do when they're performing patience. I opened the folder. I placed the first document on the table and walked it to the clerk and asked that it be entered into the record, then the second, then the third. They were bank statements, not the joint account, the other accounts. The ones that moved money through LLCs with names like Forest Advisory Group and Pinnacle Horizon Consulting, names that sounded like real companies and were not real companies, not in any meaningful sense. Not in the sense of having offices or employees or actual clients who received actual services. Grant's attorney stood up. Objection, Your Honor. This is outside the scope of— It is directly within the scope of equitable distribution, I said. And I heard my voice come out steady, which surprised me a little. Because money that was earned during our marriage and moved through these structures represents marital assets that have not been disclosed in the petitioner's financial affidavit. Judge Callahan looked at the documents. He looked at them for a long time. Counsel, he said to Grant's attorney, would you like to respond? There was a pause. In that pause, I heard the woman in the gallery shift in her seat. Grant's attorney said something about documentation being unverified, about the source being questionable, about the circumstances under which I might have obtained. I obtained them from accounts that bore my name as a joint account holder, I said, which is legal. I organized them. I filed them. I am presenting them. Judge Callahan asked both parties to approach the bench. I walked up with my folder. Grant's attorney walked up with his leather portfolio and his cufflinks and the slight pallor that had entered his face in the last 4 minutes. The judge looked at the documents again. He looked at my husband's attorney. Counsel, he said, and his voice was very even. I'm going to ask you a question and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Are you aware of any pending federal interest in your client's financial holdings? The attorney said he was not. Judge Callahan looked at him for a moment. I'd suggest you make some calls during recess. We recessed for 20 minutes. I sat at my table and drank water from a bottle I had brought, and I did not look at my husband. And I did not look at the woman in the front row. And I looked at my hands, which were shaking slightly. And I thought, this is the part where you just keep going. When court resumed, Grant's attorney asked for a continuance. Judge Callahan granted a brief one. In the hallway, while we waited, I sat on a wooden bench and my sister called me and I answered and she said, the agents confirmed. The warrant cleared this morning. They're coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office. I sat with that information for a moment. Okay, I said. Are you okay? She asked. I will be, I said. When we returned to the courtroom and resumed the session, it was another 40 minutes of procedural back and forth. Motions and counter-motions, arguments about disclosure and discovery. Through all of it, Grant sat very still in his chair. I had watched him in the gallery of our life for years. The way he commanded rooms, the way he moved through spaces expecting them to yield, the way he spoke to people with the particular confidence of a man who has never had to consider what might happen if things went wrong. That version of him was not present in that courtroom. He looked like someone calculating, subtracting things. When the session ended, Judge Callahan issued a temporary hold on asset transfers pending further review. He looked at me as he said it, not a long look, not theatrical, just a look that meant, I see what you did here, and it was competent. That was enough. In the hallway, two men in dark jackets were waiting near the exit. They had the kind of stillness that is not relaxed. Grant saw them when we came through the double doors and stopped walking. I did not stop walking. I walked past my husband, past his attorney who was already on his phone, past the woman in the champagne blouse who was standing very still and had begun to understand that she had come to the wrong theater expecting the wrong ending, and I walked to the elevator and pressed the button and waited. The doors opened. I stepped in. I pressed the lobby button. As the doors closed, I could hear voices behind me and the particular language of a situation becoming official, and I pressed my back against the cool wall of the elevator and closed my eyes for exactly the duration of that descent, which was maybe 10 seconds. Which was enough time to let myself shake if I needed to. I needed to. That was 14 months ago. The divorce was finalized 7 months after the hearing, once the legal complexities of his situation were sufficiently untangled to allow it. The settlement I received reflected the full marital estate, equitably distributed, without the structures he had used to obscure it. The house sold. I received my share. It was enough to restart, which is not a small thing. Grant is facing federal charges. I am not going to tell you I feel nothing about that, because I was married to him for 6 years and I am a person, not a verdict. But I will tell you that I feel clear. I feel like someone who looked at a situation clearly and did not let fear make her smaller than she needed to be. I kept the blazer. It still doesn't fit perfectly in the shoulders. I wore it again last month to a meeting about a job I was offered. Financial analyst, mid-size firm, nothing glamorous. The kind of work I am good at and had missed without fully knowing I'd missed it. The woman who interviewed me looked at my resume and asked about the 6-year gap, and I said I had taken time away from the workforce and had recently returned, and she nodded the way competent people nod when an answer is sufficient and the work in front of them is what matters. I got the job. My sister took me to dinner to celebrate. We sat outside because the weather was finally warm, and we ordered too much food and we talked for 4 hours about nothing important, and at some point she said, "You know, I'm proud of you." And I said, "I know." And she said, "You don't have to be modest." And I said, "I'm not being modest. I just know. I had done the work. I had stayed level when I needed to be level. I had walked into a room where everyone expected me to be the smallest person present, and I had been, instead, the most prepared. That is the only kind of victory I trust anymore. Not the kind that comes from somewhere outside yourself. The kind you built quietly while nobody was watching. Because you understood, even when it was hard to understand, that if it was going to happen, it was going to have to be you. It was me, it was always going to be me. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened, not in a philosophical, abstract way, just in the ordinary way a person thinks when they're lying awake at 2 in the morning, replaying a sequence of events and trying to understand how each piece connected to the next. Grant made choices. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not one big choice, but hundreds of small ones, over years, each of which probably felt low risk in the moment. The choice to hide money in structures that didn't hold up to scrutiny, the choice to treat our marriage as a convenience rather than a partnership, the choice to hand me divorce papers at a kitchen table and tell me, with genuine indifference, that I couldn't afford to fight back. Every one of those choices was his. And every one of them had a consequence he did not account for, because he had stopped looking at me long enough to miss who I actually was. That is the thing about underestimating people. It is not a neutral act. When you decide someone is small, you stop paying attention to them. And when you stop paying attention, you stop knowing what they know, what they're capable of, what they've been quietly doing while you were busy being certain of your own position. Grant was certain of his position, right up until the moment he wasn't. And by then, it was too late to revise anything. I don't think of what I did as revenge. I want to be honest about that. I didn't set out to destroy him. I set out to survive, and survival required me to be accurate. About what I knew, about what I could prove, about what I was willing to do with the information I had spent years accumulating simply by being present in my own life. The ethics of it felt straightforward to me even when nothing else did. I didn't fabricate anything. I didn't exaggerate. I organized what was true and I handed it to people whose job was to evaluate it. That is not vengeance. That is just refusing to disappear. What I understand now, that I didn't fully understand then, is that intelligence is not just what you know, it's what you do with what you know under pressure. Sitting in that parking lot after I found out about the other woman, shaking and blindsided and genuinely scared of what my life was about to become, that was the moment that mattered most. Not the hearing, not the FBI meetings. That parking lot, that 2 hours of sitting still and deciding not to react from fear, deciding instead to think. That decision was the hinge everything else turned on. Resilience looks different from the inside than it does from the outside. From the outside, it looks like strength. From the inside, it mostly feels like just not stopping. Like getting up one more time. Like ironing a blazer that doesn't quite fit because it's what you have and you're gonna walk into that room anyway. I showed up, in that too big navy blazer with my rubber-banded folders and my color-coded tabs. I showed up. And I kept showing up until it was over. Alice told me once that the bravest thing isn't the dramatic moment. It's the quiet preparation that makes the dramatic moment possible. I think she's right. The hearing was 4 hours. The preparation was 6 weeks of evenings at the kitchen table, cross-referencing documents while my husband slept upstairs, building something methodical and true out of materials I had gathered simply by paying attention. If there is anything worth taking from what happened to me, it is this. Your circumstances do not define your ceiling. What you choose to do inside those circumstances, how carefully you think, how honestly you act, how long you're willing to stay steady when everything around you is designed to make you feel like giving up. That is what determines the outcome. Not luck. Not who has the better attorney. Not who walks in with the leather portfolio and the cufflinks. What determines the outcome is who did the work. I did the work.